Picture this. It's the 1970s. Bell-bottoms are in, disco is king, and if you grew up in a working-class home, your dinner plate was probably filled with cheap, no-frills meals that just got the job done. Back then, certain foods were the ultimate sign of being broke. Ingredients that were dirt cheap, easy to stretch, and definitely not considered gourmet. But fast forward a few decades, and guess what? Some of those so-called poverty meals are now served in high-end restaurants with fancy price tags. From Spam sandwiches to awful meats and even instant ramen, what was once a necessity for struggling families has somehow become a hipster-approved delicacy. So what exactly were people eating in the 70s when money was tight, and how did these humble dishes go from shameful to trendy? Let's take a nostalgic and slightly shocking trip down the dinner table of the past. Spam.
If you think Spam is just a sandwich meat, you're wrong. This special blend of pork shoulder with ham is also a great breakfast meat.
First on the list, we have Spam. If you grew up in a working-class home, you'd know that that little rectangular can of mystery meat was basically a poverty badge. If you saw it on your plate, you knew the family budget was tight. Now, Spam had been around since the 1930s, feeding soldiers in World War II and making its way into kitchen cupboards across America. But by the 70s, it wasn't just a cheap food, it was the cheap food. Families struggling to make ends meet relied on it because, let's be honest, it lasted forever, it was versatile, and it didn't break the bank. Fried Spam with eggs, Spam sandwiches, Spam casseroles. If you could slap it between two slices of bread, it was dinner. But here's the kicker. Back then, people were kinda embarrassed to admit they ate Spam. It was a sign you couldn't afford a steak, chicken, or even fresh ground beef. The middle class, they were dining on roasts and TV dinners. Meanwhile, Spam was for families stretching every dollar. Fast forward to now, and Spam's having a renaissance. Hipster chefs and foodies are putting gourmet twists on it. But in the 70s, if you were eating Spam, you weren't living the high life, you were just trying to get by. Powdered milk.
I found a recipe you won't find in a cookbook, but it's sure nutritious and a real money saver too. Take a quart of Carnation Instant Non-Fat Dry Milk.
Picture this. It's the 1970s. You wake up in the morning, shuffle into the kitchen, and there it is, your breakfast fate sealed in a dull, government-issued box. Powdered milk, the ultimate sign that your family was struggling. For millions of Americans, especially those on government assistance, powdered milk wasn't just an option, it was the only option. It came in big, industrial-sized bags, courtesy of government surplus programs, and if you were unlucky enough to experience it, you remember that unmistakable, chalky texture and weird aftertaste. No matter how much you stirred, it never fully dissolved. There were always those tiny, suspicious clumps floating at the top. In the 1970s, inflation was out of control and grocery prices skyrocketed. Families on tight budgets had to stretch every dollar, and fresh milk, that was a luxury. Powdered milk was cheaper, lasted longer, and didn't need refrigeration, perfect for households that couldn't afford to waste a single drop. But let's be real, nobody actually liked it. Kids dreaded it, parents tolerated it, and if you had guests over, you definitely weren't serving it. In fact, some families went so far as to secretly mix it with real milk, hoping to disguise the taste. Others just learned to live with it because, well, they had no choice. Fast forward to today, and powdered milk still exists, but it's mostly used for baking or emergency food storage. It no longer carries the same stigma, but for those who lived through it in the 70s, the sight of that pale, sad liquid in a glass, that's a throwback to tougher times, one sip at a time. Government cheese. Up next, we have government cheese. Yep, government cheese. This massive, waxy, bright orange block of dairy became the unofficial symbol of struggle for low-income American families. And if you grew up eating it, you knew what it meant. So, what exactly was government cheese? Well, during the 70s and 80s, the US had a serious dairy surplus. Farmers were producing way more milk than people were drinking, and instead of letting it go to waste, the government bought up all the excess, processed it into cheese, and handed it out to struggling families as part of food assistance programs. Now, here's the thing. This cheese wasn't like the fancy cheddar you'd find at the store. It came in a plain cardboard box with zero branding. It was dense, hard to slice, and melted weird. But for millions of Americans, it was a lifesaver, stretching meals, making grilled cheese sandwiches, and topping casseroles. The downside? If you had government cheese, everybody knew you were poor. It wasn't just food, it was a label. Kids would get teased at school, and families felt the stigma of relying on handouts. But here's the wild part. Some people actually miss it. That unique processed taste, nostalgic. So, while government cheese might have been a symbol of hard times, it also represented resilience, making the best of what you had. And honestly, if you know, you know. Canned meat.
Real good stew. The stew. It's good.
Oh, it's just,
Next on our list, we have canned meat. Now don't get it twisted, canned meats weren't new. They'd been around for decades, feeding soldiers in wartime and helping families stretch their grocery budgets. But by the 70s, if canned meat was a staple in your house, it usually meant one thing: money was tight. Fresh meat, too expensive. Frozen meat, maybe, but freezers weren't in every home. Canned meat, that was the budget king. You could fry it, slap it on white bread, or mix it with whatever leftovers you had. It wasn't gourmet, but it filled you up. The ads made it look fancy, but let's be real, kids at the lunch table knew the truth. If you pulled out a Spam sandwich, you might get some side-eye. It was the meal of the struggling, the broke, the paycheck-to-paycheck families trying to make it work. Funny thing is, today, canned meat is making a comeback. Spam's a hit in high-end restaurants, and people pay good money for what used to be a poor man's meal. Goes to show, one man's struggle plate is another man's gourmet nostalgia. Hot dog.
Hot dogs, Armour hot dogs. What kind of kids eat Armour hot dogs?
Ah, the humble hot dog, an American classic. Today, you'll find them at baseball games, backyard barbecues, and gourmet food trucks. But rewind to the 1970s, and hot dogs weren't some trendy street food. They were a dead giveaway that you were broke. Back in the 70s, if your family was eating hot dogs for dinner, it wasn't because you wanted to, it was because you had to. Hot dogs were cheap, filling, and easy to cook, making them a staple in low-income households. A pack of Franks cost next to nothing, and when money was tight, you could stretch them out with a loaf of white bread instead of actual hot dog buns. Pair them with some canned beans or instant mac and cheese, and boom, you had a meal that cost pennies but screamed hard times. And let's talk about quality. These weren't the all-beef, preservative-free, artisanal sausages you see today. Nope, we're talking about the lowest grade mystery meat packed with fillers and nitrates, sitting in their own eerie juice inside vacuum-sealed plastic. You knew you were getting the bottom of the barrel when the first ingredient wasn't even beef or pork, it was just mechanically separated meat. Of course, not everyone who ate hot dogs in the 70s was struggling. They were still a hit at cookouts and ball games. But if you were eating them on a random Tuesday night, boiled on the stovetop, and served with government cheese, it probably wasn't by choice. So while today's foodies might try to elevate the hot dog, for many who grew up in the 70s, they'll always be a reminder of when times were tough. Bologna sandwiches.
Well, I'm making a fried bologna sandwich.
If you grew up in a working-class home back in the 70s, odds are you've had a bologna sandwich or two, or 1,000. And let's be real, if your mom slapped a slice of fried bologna between two pieces of Wonder Bread, maybe with a little mayo if you were lucky, that was the universal sign that times were tight. Bologna sandwiches were the unofficial meal of being broke, and here's why. First off, bologna was cheap. You could grab a whole pack for next to nothing, and it lasted forever in the fridge. It was basically the hot dog's less respected cousin, processed, salty, and questionably sourced, but hey, it got the job done. And let's not forget how versatile this meal was. Some folks fried their bologna to give it that little gourmet touch, while others just slapped it on cold with a slice of that government cheese. Either way, if you had one in your lunchbox, it was a dead giveaway that your family was stretching every dollar. But here's the thing, bologna sandwiches weren't just food, they were a feeling. The feeling of sitting at the kitchen table, staring at that sad little sandwich while dreaming of a McDonald's cheeseburger. The feeling of watching wealthier kids at school pull out Lunchables while you had, yet again, another bologna and mustard special. Fast forward to today, and bologna sandwiches have a nostalgic, almost ironic charm. But back in the 70s, if that was on your plate, it meant one thing. You were eating on a budget, whether you liked it or not. Ramen noodles.
Japanese traditions date back thousands of years. Some have changed slightly. Some have even made it to America. Like the authentic taste of Nissan's Top Ramen.
Today, ramen noodles have a bit of a cult following. Foodies are out here paying $15 a bowl for gourmet versions. But back in the 70s, it was straight up survival food. If you had a pack of instant ramen in your cupboard, odds were you were scraping by. Let's talk context. The 1970s wasn't exactly smooth sailing economically. Inflation was sky high, unemployment was on the rise, and wages not keeping up. Enter instant ramen, a dirt cheap, calorie-packed meal that could feed you for literal pennies. Momofuku Ando, the guy behind Nissin, had introduced instant ramen in the 50s, but by the 70s, it became a staple for students, struggling workers, and anyone living paycheck to paycheck. And let's be real, it wasn't exactly a balanced meal. A pack of ramen was loaded with salt, and the seasoning packet, pure MSG magic. But when you're broke, you're not exactly worried about your sodium intake. You're just trying to eat. What's wild is how ramen went from a your poor meal to a full-blown foodie obsession. Now, high-end chefs chefs are making fancy versions with pork belly and soft-boiled eggs. But in the 1970s, if you were eating ramen, it wasn't by choice. It was because your wallet said so. Beans and rice.
What are we talking about? Red beans and rice.
Beans and rice. A simple meal, right? But back in the 1970s, this humble dish wasn't just food. It was a social status. If you were eating beans and rice for dinner, it usually meant one thing: you were broke. Let's set the scene. The 70s were a wild time. Bell-bottoms, disco, and yes, economic struggle. Inflation was on the rise. Jobs were shaky, and for working-class families, stretching every dollar was a survival skill. Along came beans and rice, the ultimate budget meal. Why beans and rice? First off, they were dirt cheap. You could buy a big bag of dried beans for next to nothing, and rice even cheaper. Plus, they lasted forever. No fridge, no problem. Just soak the beans, throw them in a pot, and boom, dinner for the whole family. But here's the catch. If you were eating this all the time, it wasn't by choice. Beans and rice weren't trendy like they are today. No Chipotle burrito bowls, no foodie Instagram posts. It was just a meal that filled you up when money was tight. Funny enough, what was once considered a poverty meal is now a staple in fancy restaurants. But back then, if someone asked what you had for dinner and you said beans and rice, they knew times were tough. What was once survival food is now a classic. But for those who lived through it, beans and rice will always tell a bigger story. Cornbread and milk. Ever heard of cornbread and milk as a meal? No, not a side dish, not a snack, a full-on meal. If you grew up in the South or in a working-class home during the 1970s, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about. This wasn't some trendy rustic farmhouse dish. This was survival food, plain and simple. Cornbread has deep roots in American history, especially in the South and Appalachia, where wheat flour was expensive, but cornmeal cheap and easy to come by. Add milk, whatever kind you had, fresh buttermilk, or even just watered down skim, and you had a filling, if not exactly exciting, meal. By the 1970s, cornbread and milk wasn't just a recipe, it was a symbol that times were tough. Ask anyone who grew up poor in the 70s and they'll tell you this meal wasn't a choice. It was a necessity. Maybe there wasn't enough money for groceries that week. Maybe you were stretching what little you had, and if you didn't have cornbread, you crumbled up saltine crackers into your milk instead. Same struggle, different texture. What's crazy is that today, you'll find cornbread and milk in high-end restaurants as some kind of nostalgic comfort food. But for those who lived it, there's no nostalgia, just memories of hard times and empty wallets. So next time you see cornbread on a fancy menu, remember, what was once a poor man's meal is now gourmet. Funny how the world works, huh? Canned vegetables.
Welcome to another video of opening decades-old canned foods.
If you grew up in the 1970s, there's a good chance you remember canned vegetables showing up on the dinner table, whether you wanted them there or not. But what most people don't realize is that during this era, canned veggies weren't just a convenient side dish. They became a subtle symbol of being poor. See, back in the 70s, fresh produce wasn't as accessible or affordable as it is today. Farmers markets weren't trendy, they were rare. Supermarkets didn't stock endless aisles of organic kale and microgreens. Instead, most families relied on what they could afford, and for lower-income households, that meant cans. Green beans, peas, corn, or the dreaded mixed vegetables, canned foods were cheap, had a long shelf life, and could stretch a meal when money was tight. But they came with a certain stigma. Fresh produce was seen as something for wealthier families, while canned food was for those just trying to get by. Plus, canned veggies didn't exactly scream luxury. They were mushy, salty, and often lacked flavor. Kids would push them around the plate, praying they wouldn't have to take another bite. The weird part, canned food had actually been marketed as a modern convenience in earlier decades, but by the 70s, attitudes shifted. Convenience gave way to status, and suddenly, what you ate said a lot about where you stood in society. Fast forward to today, and canned veggies are making a quiet comeback thanks to the whole nostalgia core movement and rising grocery prices. But back then, a plate of canned green beans could tell the whole neighborhood how much your family was struggling, whether you liked it or not. Funny how food can say so much without saying anything at all. Grits and oatmeal. Grits and oatmeal, two breakfast staples that, for many families, weren't just a choice, they were a necessity. If you had a steaming bowl of grits or oatmeal on your table back in the day, chances are your family wasn't rolling in cash. But why did these meals become a symbol of hard times? Let's break it down. Now, back in the 70s, times were tough for a lot of people. The economy was struggling, inflation was high, and wages, well, they weren't exactly keeping up. Families had to stretch every dollar, and that meant making meals that were cheap, filling, and could feed a whole household without breaking the bank. Then we had grits and oatmeal, two of the most affordable foods on the market. Grits, made from ground corn, were a southern staple. You could buy them in bulk for next to nothing, add a little butter if you were lucky, and boom, you had breakfast. Oatmeal, on the other hand, was the northern equivalent. Rolled oats were cheap, nutritious, and easy to make with just water and a pinch of sugar, if you could afford the luxury. Now don't get me wrong, plenty of people still love grits and oatmeal today, but back then, if that's all you had, it was a clear sign that money was tight. No bacon, no eggs, no fancy cereals, just a bowl of mush. Kids dreaded it, adults tolerated it, and for many, it became a lasting reminder of financial struggle. But here's the thing, grits and oatmeal weren't just poor folks' food, they were survival food, and today, they've made a comeback. What do you think? Still struggle meals or timeless classics? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Mac and cheese.
It is also like one of my all-time favorite recipes in our cookbook, a baked mac and cheese.
Back in the 70s, mac and cheese wasn't the trendy comfort food you see on Instagram today, loaded with lobster and truffle oil. Nope, it was the ultimate "we're broke and this is dinner" meal. Boxed mac and cheese, usually Kraft, was cheap, fast, and could feed a whole family for next to nothing. You just needed a box, some butter, and a little milk, or water if things were really tight. For working-class families, especially those struggling with inflation and economic downturns, mac and cheese was a staple. If you grew up eating it multiple times a week, you probably didn't think much of it until you realized that wealthier families were dining on steak and roast chicken while you were scraping the last neon orange bite off your plate. And let's talk about that cheese powder. Today, people love the nostalgia of that radioactive-looking cheese dust, but back then, it was a symbol of cutting corners. Real cheese was expensive, so processed cheese products, think Velveeta and Kraft singles, became household essentials. They lasted longer, cost less, and got the job done. Mac and cheese also showed up in government assistance programs, food pantries, and school lunches, further cementing its status as poor people food. If your mom stocked up on the 5 for $1 sale, you knew times were tough. But here's the twist. What was once considered a meal of last resort is now a beloved classic. Upscale restaurants serve gourmet versions, and people pay $15 for what used to be a $1 dinner. Funny how things change, right? So next time you dig into a bowl of mac and cheese, remember, what was once a sign of struggle is now a symbol of comfort. Fried bologna or Spam with eggs. Have you ever had one of those meals that instantly brings back childhood memories, except they're not the kind of memories you necessarily want to relive? Yeah, let's talk about fried bologna or Spam with eggs. If you grew up in the 1970s and that was a staple in your household, chances are your family wasn't exactly rolling in cash. Look, fried bologna and Spam weren't bad. They actually tasted kinda good if you ignored the weird, rubbery texture and the fact that both smelled like regret when they hit the pan. But let's be real, nobody was eating this because they had options. Bologna was basically the off-brand hot dog of lunch meats, and Spam? Well, Spam was whatever was left over when they ran out of hot dog parts. These weren't just foods, they were economic indicators. If you walked into someone's kitchen in the 70s and saw that shiny, gelatinous hunk of Spam waiting to be sliced up, you knew times were tough. Grocery stores sold bologna by the stack for next to nothing, and a can of Spam could stretch a meal far. Parents could throw it in with eggs, slap it between 2 slices of Wonder Bread, or dice it up into some mystery casserole. And guess what? Nobody was excited about it. Fast forward to today, and both of these struggle meals have had a weird cultural redemption arc. Chefs are out here putting gourmet fried bologna sandwiches on their menus, and Spam is a delicacy in places like Hawaii. But for those who grew up in the 70s, it's hard to see past what it really was, a neon pink symbol of we can't afford bacon. So if you ever find yourself craving fried bologna or Spam with eggs, just remember, it might not have been luxury dining, but it got you through. And hey, at least it wasn't government cheese, right? Peanut butter and jelly sandwiches.
Okay, so today we were making a peanut butter and jelly, but not really. It's not just about the peanut butter and jelly as it is. Of course, we have our childhood nostalgia. Especially if you're from America, you're gonna know the peanut butter and jelly very, very well.
Up next, we have peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. Now, before you clutch your Jif jar in horror, let's break it down. Today, PB&J is a nostalgic comfort food, but back in the 70s, it wasn't exactly a flex. It was cheap, simple, and well, kind of a sign that the money was tight. See, in an era where TV dinners, hamburger helper, and bologna sandwiches were go-to meals for middle-class families, PB&J was almost too basic. Peanut butter was a government commodity item, meaning if your family was struggling, you might have gotten it for free. Bread, inexpensive and filling. Jelly, the cheapest kind, came in those glass jars that doubled as drinking cups when empty. Put it all together, and you had a meal that checked the affordable box but didn't scream luxury. Meanwhile, kids from well-off families were munching on turkey sandwiches, ham and cheese, or even thermos-packed soups. Their lunches had name-brand chips, fruit cups, and the ultimate flex, a Capri Sun or a can of soda. If your lunchbox had PB&J and a generic juice box, yeah, kids noticed. Fast forward a few decades, and PB&J has had the ultimate glow-up. People embrace it for nostalgia, health benefits, and even gourmet versions with fancy nut butters and organic jams. So next time you slap together a PB&J, just remember, what was once a sign of struggle is now an American classic. Funny how things change, right? Hit that like button if PB&J was a childhood staple for you, and let's hear your best sandwich memories in the comments. Potatoes. Alright, picture this, it's the 1970s. Bell-bottoms, disco, and potatoes. Yeah, you heard me. Potatoes weren't just food back then, they were practically a class symbol. If your family was eating potatoes for dinner night after night, chances are money was tight. In an era when TV dinners and fast food were on the rise, the humble potato was still the ultimate budget meal. Why? Because it was cheap, filling, and easy to stretch. A sack of potatoes could keep a family fed for days. You could fry them, mash them, bake them, but at the end of the day, it still meant one thing. You couldn't afford steak. In the 70s, a pound of potatoes cost around 10 cents. Compare that to a pound of beef, which could set you back nearly $1. For working class families, especially those struggling through the oil crisis and rising inflation, potatoes weren't just a side dish, they were the meal. Meanwhile, middle class families were embracing the convenience of canned soups, frozen dinners, and instant noodles. If you were still eating plain boiled potatoes every night, it was kind of a giveaway that your family wasn't rolling in cash. Fast forward to today, and potatoes have made a comeback. Fancy fries, gourmet mash, and loaded baked potatoes, now that's a luxury. But back in the 70s, if your dinner plate was mostly potatoes, well, let's just say times were tough. What about you? Ever hear stories about potato-heavy meals from your family? Drop a comment below. Homemade soup. Homemade soup. Today, it's the ultimate cozy, rustic, Pinterest-worthy meal. But back in the 1970s, if you were eating homemade soup for dinner, it probably meant one thing: you were broke. See, the 70s were a weird time. Fast food was on the rise, TV dinners were the future, and packaged processed meals were a sign that your family had made it. Meanwhile, homemade soup, that was what you ate when you had to stretch a meal as far as possible. Think about it. Soup is literally just water with whatever you have lying around. Leftover chicken bones, throw them in, a single potato, dice it up. That half a carrot from last week, perfect. Soup wasn't just a meal, it was survival mode in liquid form. Back then, if you had money, you were buying Swanson TV dinners, Spam, or the ultimate flex, Campbell's soup. Yeah, even canned soup was fancier than homemade because it meant you could afford convenience. If mom was making soup from scratch, it was probably because buying fresh meat for dinner wasn't an option. But here's the thing, what used to be a sign of struggle is now a badge of health and nostalgia. Today, homemade soup is organic, homemade, and artisanal. We're out here paying $12 for a bowl of what people in the 70s considered desperation stew. Funny how that works, huh? So next time you're simmering a pot of homemade soup, just remember, 50 years ago, that might have been a sign that payday was too far away. Cabbage-based meals. If your family was eating cabbage-based meals back in the 70s, well, it probably meant times were tough. That's right. Cabbage, the humble, leafy green vegetable, wasn't just a side dish. It was a financial survival strategy. But why was cabbage linked to being broke? And how did it go from poor people food to the health-conscious superfood we know today? Let's break it down. Cabbage was, and still is, one of the cheapest vegetables you can buy. In the 1970s, when inflation was high and wages weren't keeping up, families had to stretch their grocery budgets as far as possible. Enter cabbage, a vegetable that was dirt cheap, filled you up, and could be cooked in 100 different ways: boiled, fried, stuffed, or even raw in a slaw. Cabbage-based meals were a staple in many low-income households. Dishes like cabbage soup, boiled cabbage with potatoes, or fried cabbage with cheap cuts of meat became survival meals. Ever heard of the cabbage soup diet? It wasn't just for weight loss, it was a real-life, budget-friendly necessity for struggling families. If you walked into a house that smelled like simmering cabbage, you knew they were making the best of a tight budget. Fast forward to today, and cabbage has had a glow-up. What was once a sign of financial hardship is now praised as a high-fiber, gut-friendly superfood. Chefs put fancy spins on cabbage dishes, and suddenly, it's cool again. So next time you dig into a bowl of cabbage stew, remember, it wasn't always trendy. In the 1970s, it was survival food. Funny how things change, huh? Tuna casserole.
Today on the Stay at Home Chef, I'm showing you how to make tuna casserole.
Next on our list is tuna casserole. Now, if you grew up in this era, you know what I'm talking about. A can of tuna, a can of cream of mushroom soup, a bag of egg noodles, mix it together, throw in some crushed potato chips if you're feeling fancy, and boom, dinner is served. Cheap, easy, and everywhere. But here's the thing, tuna casserole wasn't just a meal, it was a statement. A statement that said, we don't have steak money, but we're gonna make this work. If your mom pulled out a Pyrex dish full of that creamy, fishy concoction, you knew times were tough. And if you were eating it multiple times a week, yeah, your family was struggling. The 70s were a weird time for food. The post-war boom of the 50s and 60s had introduced all these convenience meals, TV dinners, Jell-O salads, and yes, casseroles. But by the 70s, the economy had taken a downturn, and these meals weren't just about convenience anymore, they were about survival. And tuna casserole, that was the ultimate broke food icon. It was filling, it was cheap, and it used non-perishable ingredients, perfect for families trying to stretch their grocery budgets. But let's be honest, most kids hated it. It was mushy, it was fishy, and it was everywhere. Fast forward to today, and tuna casserole has this weird nostalgic or sad energy. It's a relic of a time when money was tight, creativity in the kitchen was a necessity, and eating a warm meal didn't mean you were eating well. So, were you really poor in the 1970s? If you ate tuna casserole, maybe, but you definitely weren't alone. Meatloaf.
If there's one recipe that you should know how to master, it's a classic meatloaf.
Picture this. It's the 1970s. Inflation is hitting hard, the economy is in shambles, and grocery budgets are tighter than a pair of disco pants. What's for dinner? Meatloaf. But not just any meatloaf, one that's more filler than actual meat. If your family was stretching every dollar, you knew the deal. Meatloaf was already a budget meal, but when times got rough, it became a masterclass in culinary illusion. Instead of a juicy, hearty slab of beef, you'd get a loaf bulked up with breadcrumbs, oats, crackers, or whatever else was lying around. Eggs, maybe if you were feeling fancy. Ketchup glaze on top, a must, but mainly to hide the fact that you were basically eating a brick of flavored starch. For struggling families, this wasn't just a meal, it was survival. Meat was expensive, and with gas prices soaring, jobs uncertain, and families growing, stretching a pound of ground beef to feed an entire household was a skill. Parents got creative, mixing in mashed potatoes, rice, even soup mix just to make it last. And let's not forget the wild card, gelatin. Some moms swore by it to hold everything together, making the whole thing a little too wobbly. And while some kids at school were eating TV dinners or heading to McDonald's, if you had meatloaf night, you knew exactly where your family stood. No one ever bragged about it. It was just there, week after week. And sure, maybe your mom called it her special recipe, but deep down, you knew it was just whatever was left in the pantry. Looking back, was it delicious? Debatable. Was it a sign you were broke? Absolutely. And if you ever had a slice of meatloaf that was 70% filler and 30% beef, congrats, you had the full 1970s experience. Sugar sandwiches or plain buttered bread. Picture this. It's the 1970s. You come home from school, starving, and head straight for the kitchen. You open the fridge, empty. The cabinets, not much better. But wait, there's still bread. And if you're lucky, there's butter, maybe even sugar. Congratulations, you're about to eat a meal that, for many, was the ultimate sign of being broke. Sugar sandwiches or just plain buttered bread. Now, if you've never heard of a sugar sandwich, let me break it down. It's literally just white bread slathered with butter or margarine and sprinkled with sugar. That's it. Simple, cheap, and for a lot of families struggling to make ends meet, it was survival food. The 70s were a weird time economically. Sure, there was a lot of cultural change, disco, bell-bottoms, and the rise of blockbuster movies, but financially, a lot of families were feeling the squeeze. The oil crisis, inflation, and job instability meant that stretching a grocery budget was a skill, and when you couldn't afford lunch meat or even peanut butter, you got creative. Buttered bread was another staple. If sugar was a luxury you couldn't afford, then butter, or more likely margarine, was the next best thing. It was filling, cheap, and kept you from going to bed hungry. Some kids ate it before school, some as a snack, and for some, it was dinner. Nowadays, nostalgia makes some people remember these meals fondly. Others see them as a painful reminder of struggling times. Either way, sugar sandwiches and buttered bread were the unofficial meals of the broke back in the day. So, did you or someone in your family eat these growing up? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more nostalgia-fueled deep dives. So there you have it, the so-called poor people food of the 1970s, a lineup of meals that might have once been looked down upon, but are now straight-up nostalgic classics. Back then, these dishes were all about stretching a dollar: Spam, powdered milk, government cheese, and even the humble bologna sandwich. But here's the thing, food trends change, and what was once seen as a last resort is now getting a gourmet glow-up. Ramen, people pay top dollar for that in in fancy restaurants. Meatloaf, it's a comfort food icon. And don't even get me started on how many hipster cafes are charging premium prices for peanut butter on toast. The truth is, poor people food was never about being cheap. It was about creativity, resilience, and making something delicious out of whatever you had. And if we've learned anything from history, it's that yesterday's budget meal could be tomorrow's 5-star trend. So, did you grow up eating any of these? Are there any meals from the past you'd proudly eat today? Drop a comment below, hit that like button if you enjoyed the trip down memory lane, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into food history.